For a character who died in 1996 in the first film of the franchise, Stu Macher has proven remarkably difficult to bury. Despite only appearing canonically in a single movie, he's had an unusually long afterlife in horror fandom, becoming one of the series' most beloved characters. There's a whole world of storytelling that occurs after Stu gives his final scream, and some of it you might not have even known about. Stuart Macher was born in 1978 or 1979 based on his age of 17 in 1996. He grew up in a large farmhouse at 261 Turner Lane in Woodsboro, California, where he lived with his parents and his sister, Leslie. Not much is known about Stu's childhood or early teen years, but we do know that at some point he became friends with a boy named Billy Loomis, and the two would begin attending Woodsboro High School around 1993. Stu and Billy developed a love for horror movies, often frequenting their local Bradley Video, the rental shop in the center of town. But eventually, the pair found new ways to fill their time, as Billy began dating Sydney Prescott in 1994, and Stu began dating Cassie Becker, presumably during the following year. The relationship wouldn't last long, though, before she dumped him for football player Steve Orr. Stu was devastated by the breakup, but played down how hurt he was, even pretending he had broken up with her, and began a new relationship with Tatum Riley, claiming he dumped Casey for Tatum.
Hey Stu, didn't you used to date Casey?
Yeah, for like 2 seconds.
Stu's obsession with horror films and his anger at being sidelined romantically made him the perfect person for Billy to approach in 1995 with a plan. Billy had recently met a movie director named Roman Bridger, who showed him evidence that his father had been having an affair with his girlfriend's mother, Maureen Prescott. A Hollywood-worthy drama indeed. Roman planted the idea of revenge in Billy's mind, suggesting that he kill the woman who destroyed his family. But Roman also advised him that if he was going to do it, he would need a partner. Someone to help carry out the murder, and if necessary, to sell out if things went wrong. Stu Macher happened to fit the bill perfectly. To find out Stu's real motive for becoming Ghostface, how his legacy grew the character, and the real-life killers that claim they were inspired by Scream, stick around to the end of this video. Welcome to Horror History. This one's gonna be a Scream, baby. It's a Scream episode. I sincerely hope you figured that out by now. Other than Ghostface, an identity assumed by multiple people over multiple decades, the biggest request I tend to get for Scream episodes is the Stu Macher horror history. A large part of that comes down to the casting of Matthew Lillard and his performance. Stu is chaotic and unpredictable. You never quite know what he's going to say next, and since some of Stu's lines were improvised, apparently neither did the crew.
In the sequence specifically where Skeet throws the phone at me, that was a mistake. It slipped out of his hands. So he hits me with the phone. I'm like, you hit me with the phone. I kept going, and then the scene was over because I was like, this isn't in the scene. They're gonna cut, but nobody said cut. So I literally picked the phone. I was like, did you really call the cops? My mom, dude, was so mad at me. So that whole sequence was improv.
That unpredictability makes Stu feel distinct from many traditional slasher villains. Unlike the silent, unstoppable killers that defined much of the genre, Stu is expressive and theatrical. In many ways, the character became larger than originally intended because of Lillard's casting.
I auditioned originally for the part of Billy Loomis. And I walked in and did the scene. And then I think the casting director was like, you're not making out with Nev Campbell anytime soon, but there's a crazy best friend.
Ironically, Lillard and Campbell would briefly date after Scream wrapped in 1996. It is not known if they ever made out though. I mean, technically, we don't know. But Stu's performance in the franchise didn't end with the first film. Over the years, rumors began circulating about an early draft of Scream 3 involving a so-called cult of Ghostface, where high school students were allegedly being manipulated by Stu from inside prison. Kevin Williamson has spoken in interviews about early ideas that expanded the Ghostface mythology beyond a single pair of killers, and Matthew Lillard has also claimed that he was told that Stu might return to the franchise in some capacity, which I guess is technically true. Kind of. Despite the rumors, there's no confirmed script for Scream 3 in which Stu definitely survived. The idea appears to have existed more in development conversations and conceptual outlines rather than any version that actually reached production. Over the years, there have been many references to the teen killer through the franchise, with Roman Bridger revealing that he was the one who instigated Stu and Billy's crime spree, a later Ghostface killer living in his childhood home in Scream 5, and items from his killer spree being memorialized in a personal museum in Scream 6. But nearly 3 decades after his supposed death, Matthew Lillard has finally found his way back into the Scream world once again with the release of Scream 7. But before we explore the idea of Stu Macher still being alive, we first need to analyze what was going through that head before it was crushed by that big old 90s TV in the first place. Stu was the perfect choice for a partner in crime because, like Billy, he was already displaying psychotic tendencies. But in addition to that, he was also emotionally volatile. Although it's not canon, we see this in the Scream screenplay in a scene that was ultimately cut from the film. Stu's low self-esteem made it easy for Billy to influence him. Billy then capitalized on Stu's breakup with Cassie by offering him revenge against the girl who had broken his heart, or at the very least, dented his ego. While Maureen's affair with Billy's father was a secret, her affair with Cotton Weary was common knowledge to the people of Woodsboro.
She really got around. I mean, Cotton was one thing. Everybody knew about that.
Following Roman's advice to frame someone for the murder, Billy and Stu quickly settled on Cotton. But before taking action, the two hit the books, or at least the horror section of their local video store, to study up on committing the perfect crime. Isn't it weird to think that almost half of the Scream franchise has come out over the last 4 years? It makes me nostalgic whenever I go back to the original. It takes me back to when I was a kid and everyone had a bleeding Ghostface mask for Halloween. Looking back on that time tends to make me miss the family members who have passed, friends who have drifted away, and just the way that life was when all you had to worry about was filling your candy bag. If you find yourself feeling the same way, maybe therapy can help you grieve what's been lost without letting nostalgia make the present feel bleak. You can enjoy your memories while also investing in yourself and the connections that you have now. And this video's sponsor, BetterHelp, is a great way to do it. I chose to partner with BetterHelp because they periodically check that their therapists maintain a valid license to practice as part of a rigorous process meant to ensure that you'll only be communicating with the most qualified therapists. Getting started is also simple and convenient compared to traditional in-office therapy. Just click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/CZsWorld to get 10% off your first month of therapy. It's also in the pinned comment, but I prefer if you click on it in the description. It's just cooler. That's betterhelp.com/CZsWorld. We don't get a look at Billy or Stu's video rental history, but I like to think that the two looked at movies like Dressed to Kill, April Fool's Day, and maybe even Basic Instinct, all movies that deal with the killer who manipulates events to cast suspicion on an innocent person. One night in September, Stu and Billy followed Cotton to the Prescott house and waited outside while he and Maureen got busy inside. We know it's September because the main events of Scream take place on the 1-year anniversary of Maureen's death, and these calendars tell us that that's in September. They watched as Cotton left, so inebriated he left his coat behind. Once he had gone, Billy and Stu crept into the house and headed up to Maureen's bedroom, where they stabbed her multiple times, killing her. Aware that Sydney was still inside the house, they covered Cotton's coat in Maureen's blood, and Billy simply left through the front door while wearing it, making sure Sydney would see what looked like Cotton leaving the house. Stu, meanwhile, likely slipped out the back to avoid being seen. The pair then met back up and planted the coat in Cotton's car. They waited and watched as Cotton was arrested, and with Sydney's eyewitness account of seeing him leave with the blood-soaked coat, he was found guilty and given the death sentence. Getting away with murder while Cotton paid the price gave Stu and Billy a sense of confidence. They had fooled and manipulated the police and the town itself. But that wasn't the end of it for the two teens. It's not exactly clear when they decided to continue with more killings, but getting revenge on Maureen wasn't enough for Billy. He wanted to hurt Sydney as well, and Stu still wanted revenge on Cassie. So they decided to veer away from Roman and make their own plan, a bloodbath on the anniversary of Maureen's death. They must have gone back to the video store, where I think they would have studied Psycho, where they learned that it was a good idea to dispose of the victim's car, Black Christmas, where victims are terrified by not-so-distant phone calls, Prom Night, where Stu specifically would have taken inspiration from a killer trying to right the perceived wrongs of high school life, we'll get into that part shortly, and of course, Halloween, where a masked killer comes after suburban teens with a knife. Over the following year, they formulated their plan. This time, they decided to frame Sydney's father, Neil Prescott, making it look like Neil was losing his mind, triggered by the anniversary of his wife's death to go on a spree, ending with him killing his own daughter, then himself. Stu and Billy cloned Neil's mobile phone and bought a voice modulator to disguise their voices. Clearly inspired by their favorite masked horror villains, they also purchased a Father Death costume from a 5 and dime store to conceal their identities. Assuming they paid in cash, this made it impossible to trace anything back to them.
You sell this costume every 5 and dime in the state. There's no way to track the purchase.
Now, all they had to do was wait. One night in September 1996, shortly after 10 p.m., Stu and Billy head to Cassie Becker's isolated house, kidnapping her boyfriend Steve Orth on the way.
Don't worry, Cassie and Steve didn't bite it till way after 10.
While Billy calls Cassie using the voice modulator, first pretending to have dialed the wrong number before tormenting her, Stu's role is to wait by the back door with Steve, who is bound and gagged with tape. It makes sense that Billy would give Stu the honor of killing the guy who Cassie left him for, which he does when Cassie answers one of Billy's horror movie trivia questions incorrectly. That's why it must also be Stu who throws a chair through the French window. We know he had been waiting near the back door, and obviously he'd want to get revenge on his ex. As she runs away, Stu cuts through the house and smashes through another window to intercept her, muffle her scream, and stab her in the chest. Cassie gives some fight, but for Stu, it's personal. Payback for her dumping him. When she dumps you, you're supposed to slash her tires, not slash her. Actually, don't even do that. Just listen to some Weezer and move on with your life. Why is no one ever sane anymore? See, no one can say I was not a good role model. Another reason I'm pretty sure this is Stu is that when Casey pulls his mask away, she clearly recognizes him. And it's a look of understanding, but not surprise. But the biggest evidence, I think, is that Billy would have given him these kills as motivation. The two leave her hanging in a tree, and as if that didn't send enough of a message, also gut her. In order to provide themselves with alibis, the pair then visit their girlfriends. Billy heads to Sydney's while Stu goes to see Tatum.
Stu was with me last night, okay?
Yeah, it was.
Apparently Tatum did not realize you can just go somewhere after committing a crime. You don't have to stay in the same place. One thing that I found myself wondering was if they had already gotten away with it, then why continue their crimes? It's just increasing the likelihood that they'll get caught. One potential explanation is something known as co-offending behavior, which refers to crimes committed by two or more individuals by working together, often forming a social or psychological partnership that reinforces and escalates their criminal actions. We've seen this in fiction before. Bonnie and Clyde, Smoke and Stack, Mickey and Mallory, Sly and the Gang, back to pull off their biggest heist yet on the PS2. But the fictional examples are based on a real-world phenomenon. Research shows that people involved in co-offending frequently commit acts that they wouldn't carry out alone due to factors like peer pressure, the desire for approval, shared thrill-seeking, and what psychologists call the diffusion of responsibility. Basically, the psychological weight of the crime is divided between them. Kind of like when you and your friend order 100 chicken tenders but split it 50-50, and you somehow convince yourself that this makes the calorie intake okay. Another explanation is their leader-follower dynamic. In real cases of co-offending, partnerships frequently develop where one individual may act as the primary instigator while the other participates for validation, a sense of belonging, or even just that Christmas-like atmosphere when everyone is freaking out at school the next day.
Look at this place, it's like Christmas.
But as far as real-world cases go, British killers Ian Brady and Myra Hindley operated as a pair, but Brady is widely regarded as the dominant figure, while Hindley is believed to have participated out of a craving for acceptance and approval from her partner, as they took the lives of 5 minors in the 1960s. But perhaps the most striking comparison comes from Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, two wealthy and intelligent teenagers who kidnapped and later ended the life of a boy in 1924, trying to create the perfect murder. Like Billy, Loeb was the leader, while Leopold, like Stu, willingly took on the sidekick role.
He always was the sidekick, never the lead.
Leopold and Loeb's case later inspired the play that Alfred Hitchcock's Rope was based on, about two friends who kill for the thrill and attempt to outsmart everyone around them. Add that to the list of movies Billy and Stu could have studied. Early the next morning, Stu and Billy intercepted Neil Prescott on his way to the airport, kidnapped him, and ditched his car in the woods down the road from Stu's house. Then, later that day, the Woodsboro Police Department arrived at their school to question every student about Casey's murder, where apparently they took more interest in some suspects than others.
Hey, they asked if you like to hunt?
During lunch break, or at least the script calls it lunch, I would be more inclined to just call it grapes, Stu joins his girlfriends Tatum and friends Billy, Sydney, and Randy at the water fountain, and it's one of the most revealing scenes in the entire film when it comes to understanding Stu's character. When Tatum points out that they didn't ask the girls if they like to hunt, Stu confidently says that there's no way a girl could have killed Casey and Steve.
Yeah, Casey and Steve were completely hollowed out. The fact is, it takes a man to do something like that.
Since Stu had been dumped by Casey and replaced by a football player, someone more traditionally masculine in the eyes of the high school hierarchy, the rejection likely carried more than heartbreak, but also stung his ego.
He's big and he plays football, and he'll kick the shit out of you!
His insistence that only a man could do what was done to Casey feels like a pathetic attempt at reclaiming his manhood or something. Tatum just sees it as sexist, and she's absolutely right, because at the time of writing, there has never been another male-only Ghostface grouping. Throughout the film, Stu isn't exactly subtle about his involvement in the murders and doesn't seem particularly worried about being caught. He repeatedly displays detailed knowledge of the mechanics of disembowelment.
How do you gut someone?
You take a knife and you slit him from groin to sternum.
Which is especially evident when Randy brings up his past relationship with Casey and Stu takes it as an accusation.
I didn't kill anybody.
Nobody said you did.
Thanks, buddy.
This is another great example of their leader-follower dynamic. I love how Billy's face is basically just saying, just shut up. Please just shut the f up. That night, Sydney is targeted by a Ghostface killer. You could make the argument that Stu was in on this one too, as the one hiding in the closet while Billy made the phone calls from outside. I don't think that's the case. And I have the same logic that I did about the attack at Casey's house. It's Billy's girlfriend, and it's personal for him. Her mom had an affair with his dad. This one's got Billy written all over it. I do think that Stu plays a role later though, after things go wrong and Billy is arrested. That night, Sydney receives another Ghostface call. I doubt Billy risked making the call from jail, but I would believe that he used his phone call to contact Stu, who would automatically know that he should call Sydney using the clone of Mr. Prescott's phone in order to cast suspicion off of his partner in crime, since no one suspected multiple killers at this point. And that includes Sydney, another reason that I think there was only one person at her house that day. The following morning at school, he further sells the deception when Sydney asks if Billy is okay.
Oh, you mean after you branded him the Candyman? No, his heart's broken.
I would say add Candyman to the list of movies they've studied, but I don't think there's much they could take from the legendized portrait painter who shows up when you say his name in the mirror. Then again, maybe Billy actually did take some inspiration from that one. Screw it, go ahead and add it. But anyway, Stu's defensiveness shows that he isn't in it for the same reasons as Billy. He's almost channeling the feeling of rejection he experienced from Cassie in this response. Shortly after, they see a student dressed in a Father Death costume running down the hallways screaming and trying to scare the other students. If I had to describe his reaction, I'd say that Stu looks excited. It's like Stu sees the murders as a game. He's witnessing his crimes being immortalized and kind of celebrated in real time. The moment also has one of my favorite little windows into what Stu and Tatum's relationship was like.
Stupidity leak.
As the students leave school, Stu invites them to an impromptu party at his house, but of course this is not an impromptu party, it's the final stage of Stu and Billy's plan. Everything has been leading to the final act. Before the party, Stu and Billy visit the video store while Randy is on shift. The store is packed with people stocking up on horror VHS tapes now that the town is on lockdown due to a curfew. Stu knocks the videos out of Randy's hands as he's stacking shelves, asks him if he's coming to the party, and learns of Randy's belief that Billy is guilty, citing a possible motive that Billy snapped because Sydney wouldn't go all the way with him.
What, is she saving herself for you?
Maybe. Now that Billy tried to mutilate her, do you think Sid would go out with me?
No, I don't at all.
He does take the opportunity to plant a seed of suspicion on Neil Prescott though.
I think it's her father.
Why can't they find her pops, man?
Before the party, Stu slips into this red silk robe. I think this movie made me think this was like the default thing you're supposed to wear when you host a party, because when I was younger, I just imagined myself one day hosting a party and looking exactly like this. The story is kind of interesting. I guess during the production in Northern California, the cast and crew were staying at this hotel, and Matthew Lillard just saw one of the workers in the costume department wearing his own personal robe and thought it would be fitting for the character. And it's honestly kind of a great choice. They just had to be careful that nothing happened to it because they didn't have multiple copies. By the way, I have not worn this while hosting a party, but I did wear a similar robe when I was the other father for Halloween last year. CZsWorld Try Not to Bring Up Coraline Challenge failed. Again. After curfew, Stu sits on the sofa with Tatum and Sydney as the group of teens choose one of the horror films Randy brought from the video store with him. Stu hears the doorbell ring and goes to answer it after asking Tatum to go grab him another beer. Then he slips away from the crowd as they're distracted by the arrival of Deputy Riley and TV journalist Gail Weathers. He switches into the Father Death costume and toys with Tatum until she realizes it's not just Randy messing around with her. She tries to escape through the doggy door, and all he has to do is activate it and watch as her neck is snapped on the garage door frame. It's kind of a distant and impersonal kill, especially compared to his close-up strangulation of Cassie. Makes me think that Tatum was more of a fallback, and Cassie was the one that he actually had feelings for. There is some debate over who actually kills Tatum, but by now you already know how I feel about this. They each wanted to kill their own girlfriends. Billy had complex motivations, and Stu was motivated mostly by passion and peer pressure. Sure, there isn't as much passion in the Tatum kill, but when you start looking at the timeline more closely, it still has to be Stu. For Billy to be the killer, he would need to arrive at Stu's house unseen, slip into the garage, murder Tatum, and then leave again without anyone noticing. I've drawn out both scenarios, and long story short, it makes a lot more sense if Billy was the one to hang Principal Hembry's body from the goalpost at the high school while Stu took care of Tatum. That's clearly what it's supposed to be. We next see Stu as he's saying goodbye to some guests, and Billy arrives in the doorway, so Stu encourages him and Sydney to use his parents' bedroom to talk things out while he watches Halloween with the remaining party guests, feigning repulsion at the death scenes and jokingly complaining that they haven't seen Jamie Lee Curtis's breasts yet. Unlike horror icons like Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees, whose evil and monstrosity are immediately visible, Stu doesn't look like a villain. He's popular, funny, and charismatic. In fact, he thrives socially. But instead of returning to watching Halloween, he sneaks off. You could make the case that Stu was the one to call the house and report that Principal Hembry had been killed and hung from a goalpost at the school as a means of distraction to clear out the last guests so they could begin the final confrontation. However, we don't hear the voice, and it feels a little too calculating to be Stu, so I'll leave that as a maybe. But he was definitely the one to head upstairs in costume and pretend to kill Billy in front of Sid before performing his now signature knife wipe. And like the robe, there's an interesting story behind that as well. It was never meant to be a signature move. They had already filmed other shots in this scene where Stu is chasing Sydney with a clean knife, so it was actually just something they came up with to cover the continuity error, and just ended up looking cool. It gets used a bit later in this film, becomes a staple of future Ghostfaces, and actor Matthew Lillard even brought it back in Five Nights at Freddy's, which apparently he did just instinctually.
It's something I did instinctually that the director liked and had me do it again. I don't think I realized it was in Scream. Just for the record, I haven't seen Scream in 20 years.
I just love that we've reached the point in society where you can see Ghostface standing in line to ask a question behind the puppets, and Mario back there too for good measure. Anyway, after chasing Sydney out the attic window, Stu also almost takes out Randy, who is drunk on the sofa, but gets distracted by Sydney's screams for help outside, where the chase continues, and Kenny, the cameraman, is a casualty of the carnage. Dewey shows up and gets stabbed as well, signature knife wipe, and Stu even prevents Sydney from leaving by dangling the car keys in front of her. However, she is able to get back to the house. At this point, Stu probably realizes that he'll be locked out, so he ditches the costume and runs to the front door, where he finds Randy screaming at Sydney, urging them to get out of there and accusing Stu of killing Tatum, to which Sydney slams the door on them. So Stu leaves Randy and circles around to the back of the house, and I love the moment where he traps Sydney between himself and Billy in the foyer.
Surprise, Sydney.
The fact that he doesn't make eye contact with her when he appears just makes him look so unhinged, and it's the beginning of his wacky behavior taking on a new, scarier context after the audience learns that he's the killer. They pin Sydney in the kitchen and tell her they're going to play a game.
I want to play a game.
Oops, wrong Billy. I can't believe I haven't done that joke already, but I actually don't think I did. Correct me if I'm wrong. You can just see Stu's excitement bubbling over in this scene, as if this was the moment he watched all of these classic horror movies for.
It's a fun game, Sydney. See, we ask you a question, and if you get it wrong, booga! You die.
I need to start screaming "Boogat" more as a euphemism for a gunshot. Despite having Sydney surrounded, Stu and Billy's reign was coming to a close much sooner than they anticipated. But it's actually the aftermath that I find the most interesting. Together, Billy and Stu torment Sydney about her mother's promiscuity, claiming they did her a favor by killing her and putting her out of her misery. When Billy confesses his motive for killing Maureen, an affair with Billy's own father that broke up his family, I honestly can't tell if Stu was privy to this information or not. He looks kind of shocked, but then again he does move on pretty quickly, mocking Sydney for no longer being a virgin before leaving to retrieve her father from the closet. As the clock rolls past midnight into the 1-year anniversary of Maureen's death, Stu drags Neil into the kitchen and reveals their plan to frame her father. Stu plants the voice modulator and the mobile phone in Neil's jacket pocket to help make him look like the killer. Although, bizarrely, he doesn't wipe his own fingerprints off of them. I guess they forgot to watch CZsWorld in their horror movie research.
Imagine the will it takes to keep a man bound for a full year, to sever his hand and use it to plant fingerprints.
The plan is to make themselves look like the only surviving victim, sustaining only shallow knife wounds on the sides of their bodies. But Billy becomes overzealous, stabbing Stu far deeper than planned.
I'm feeling woozy here.
Me staying up late finishing this video. They run into an issue when their gun goes missing, and they find it in the hands of Gail Weathers. The killers find themselves held at gunpoint until Billy notices that the safety is on and kicks her out the door, knocking her unconscious. But Stu discovers another problem when he sees Sydney had used the distraction to escape from the kitchen. But by this point, Stu isn't much help, as he begins feeling the effects of too much blood loss and collapses into a chair. My analysis of co-offending crimes does line up nicely with Stu's stated motive.
Peer pressure. I'm far too sensitive.
And as he realizes Sid may have the upper hand and that she called the police, we see just how immature he is, giving even greater weight to the peer pressure motive.
My mom and dad are gonna be so mad.
From the kitchen, Stu hears the fight between Sydney and Billy and runs in to find Sydney removing a father death mask and Billy on the floor, having just been stabbed with an umbrella. Presuming his friend and partner in crime is dead, he uses the last of his energy to run at Sydney and attack her one more time. She knees him in the crotch, he punches her in the face, and eventually the pair roll over the sofa with him landing on top. He confesses that he's always had a thing for her, but she's less than thrilled and escapes his grasp by biting his hand, hitting him over the head with the vase, and finally dropping the TV on his head, electrocuting him and bringing Stu Macher's performance to a close. I've always found it cool that if this is where he dies, the last thing he ever sees is Jamie Lee Curtis's performance in Halloween. You may remember that this is the movie I identified as the one he most definitely would have studied with Billy while planning out their murders. But in the end, Scream ends very much the same way that Halloween does, with the hunted final girl becoming the hunter and getting the best of the masked villain. But where Halloween deliberately sets things up for Michael Myers to return, Stu's fate, for many years, remained more ambiguous. At some point over the years, a theory began to circulate that Stu had survived the TV falling on his head and that he was still alive. The theory gains traction with supposed sightings of him during a party at the sorority house Delta Lambda Zeta at Windsor College in 1997.
A man fitting Macher's description was spotted at a sorority party at Windsor College in 1997.
I've never been of the belief that this was Stu though. If he had survived the TV incident, he'd certainly be in prison. He wouldn't just be casually kicking it at a college party 7 months later. A party that Sydney was at, by the way. This is clearly just a different character being played by Matthew Lillard. It seems that there just wasn't much fanfare around the funeral and burial of Stu though, because the rumor that he's not dead persisted in both the world of Scream and in our own world.
So Stu was never a confirmed kill. Will we see him again?
I have no idea.
However, at this point, I'm pretty confident that Stu's survival is highly unlikely. A body was recovered from the Macher house following the events of 1996 and later buried. Officially, Stu Macher is listed as deceased and is even recorded as dead by the New York Police Department and the FBI in Scream 6.
TV that killed Stu Macher.
If you believe he's dead.
But that wasn't the only way Stu's legacy lived on. Gail Weathers would go on to publish their story in her book, The Woodsboro Murders, in 1996. Her book was the inspiration for a movie, Stab, which came out the following year in April 1997. In the movie, Stu is played by Vince Vaughn, before his breakout comedy roles in the 2000s and before his appearance in the Psycho remake in 1998. At the time, Vaughn was known for his role in Swingers and a supporting role in Rudy. Getting the Stu Macher part was probably really puzzling at the time. Stab began a long-running franchise, which in turn inspired multiple copycat Ghostfaces over the decades, following the footsteps of Stu Macher and his partner Billy. At some point after the events of 1996, the Macher family sold the farmhouse on Turner Lane, and it was eventually bought by the Freeman family. Their daughter Amber's obsession with Stu and Billy and the original Stab movie would eventually lead to her becoming a copycat Ghostface killer herself in 2022. And her dynamic with her partner in crime, Richie Kirsch, mirrors the dynamic of Billy and Stu in a way, with Richie playing the incognito boyfriend and Amber playing the one who actually does most of the killing. Like I said in a previous video, at some point we need to talk about Amber. But the confusion and hysteria over Stu's fate hits a fever pitch when Stu's intake form mysteriously goes missing from his medical records, and even Sydney and Gail began to believe the rumors. The biggest so-called comeback for Stu happens in 2026, maybe 2027. It's stated several times to be 30 years after Stu's death.
So this dead dude from 30 years ago, he's not so dead?
Nobody recognized him for 3 decades?
This person isn't a fan of Stab movies. They're a fan of Sidney Prescott. Not the Sidney of today, though. The Sidney of 30 years ago.
I've been waiting for this interview for 30 years.
Though it's possible that everyone is rounding up or down to 30 years, the new era of Scream seems to like the idea of matching the release dates of each movie with the year that they're set, even though it's not accurate for Scream 3. Stu's digital comeback looks like it's probably fall or spring, but it's not stated to be an anniversary killing like we've seen a couple of times before, so fall 2026 makes the most sense. The Macher house has been sold once again and transformed into a vacation rental called the Macher House Experience, where guests could pay to spend a night in the infamous murder house and check out all of the memorabilia of both the Stab movie and the real-life killings. Which is actually what's happening with the house in real life, if you have $3,500 to burn, of course. Speaking of burning, another copycat Ghostface killer emerged, and the Macher family home was set on fire and left to burn down. The culprit was Jessica Bowden, a mental patient who was upset that Sidney Prescott didn't live up to the parasocial idea that she'd created in her head after reading her book, and decided to create a virtual version of an aged-up Stu to terrorize Sidney and her daughter.
Wow, we're all computery.
Oh yeah, wow, because of the computer.
So she recruits this AI specialist named Marco to help create this deepfake version of Stu. Yeah, they really made the villain of a Scream movie a fucking VTuber and his Discord kitten. Jessica used V-Stu to create the illusion that Stu was alive, on the loose, and continuing with the spree that he had started back in Woodsboro.
Oh my God, it's so good to see you. I always had a thing for you, Sid.
Honestly, that should have been the giveaway. If the real-life Matthew Lillard doesn't remember wiping the knife after 27 years, would we really expect Stu Macher to remember the last thing he said to Sydney after 30? Still, the performance here does a great job of capturing the unhinged theatrical essence of Stu. Vince Vaughn must have done a great job portraying him, and then Marco could have used that data to train the AI model. I think he might have also used a little bit of Nightmare on Elm Street 3 as well.
It's showtime. Welcome to prime time.
Jessica uses V-Stu to send Sydney into a panic on more than one occasion when she's separated from her daughter, and eventually brings out deepfake versions of other Ghostface killers, like Nancy Loomis and Roman Bridger. V-Stu is an obvious commentary on the dangers of technology and believing everything that you see online. Sydney and Gail are sent into hysterics over scenes of their former enemy broadcasted over video chat, making it easy to manipulate them with a few lies when they investigate the mental hospital where Stu is supposedly being kept. It's the Scream movie version of your boomer grandparents believing that an 8-year-old girl resurrected Christ using only spaghetti. Everyone do me a favor and hit him with the classic, "Your AI slop bores me." This kid is actually such a king. He's actually my hero. The theme of not believing everything you see extends to Jessica as well, because it was her skewed perception of Sydney in her autobiography that caused Jessica to go crazy, kill her husband, and land herself in a psychiatric hospital in the first place. So she decided to step up to Stu Macher's mantle. And unfortunately, Jessica's mental break is not entirely based on fiction, because she's not the only one who tried to act out the crimes of Stu Macher. If you saw my horror history on Billy Loomis, or my episode on horror movies you didn't know were based on real life, then you'll know that Scream was loosely inspired by the Gainesville Ripper, Danny Rolling, who killed 5 college students in Florida in 1990. Although there's no credible evidence that Rolling was inspired by the media, some journalists tried to frame it as such by describing the crime scenes as horror movie-like. It was a continuation of the moral panic that began in the 1980s, that horror films, heavy metal, and video games were being used as instruction manuals rather than entertainment by the youth of the day. They would not have liked me, or my side channel Pumpkin Metal, where I do metal band history episodes. But Scream takes a different stance. Rather than blaming horror, the film uses its 2 killers to mock the idea that movies are responsible for violence.
Movies don't create psychos. Movies make psychos more creative!
Stu and Billy plans to exploit society's fear of violent films, but there is a cyclical nature to Scream, and this work of fiction inspired by reality eventually re-entered it. In 2006, 16-year-old Cassie Stoddart was house-sitting for relatives in Pocatello, Idaho. That evening, 2 of her classmates, Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk, visited the house and watched a movie with Cassie and her boyfriend, Matt Beckham. They eventually left, claiming they were going to the theater, but not before secretly unlocking the basement door so that they could return later. Wearing dark clothing and white masks, they came back that night and attempted to lure Cassie and Matt downstairs by cutting the power. Matt called his mother to ask if he could sleep over with his terrified girlfriend, but she refused, offering instead for Cassie to come to their house. But not wanting to leave her aunt's dogs that she was caring for, Cassie decided to stay at the house alone. When Matt eventually left, Draper and Adamczyk cut the lights once again and crept upstairs, where they stabbed Cassie around 30 times. Like Billy and Stu, Draper and Adamczyk had pre-planned the murder and always intended for Cassie to be the first victim. They had reportedly drawn up a death list of intended victims, treating the violence as part of a larger narrative. The pair had also recorded themselves before and after the murder, framing the whole thing like a movie. The recordings included an apology to Stoddart's family and Draper apparently saying that they were going to be just like Scream. The teens were tried as adults, and both of them tried to place the blame on the other, kind of like how Stu blamed peer pressure. The evidence of the recordings led to them both being convicted of first-degree murder, and they were sentenced to life in prison, which is still preferable to having your head crushed by a big 90s TV. Obviously, this case and other similar cases do not mean that the film was responsible for the violence, and it's been scientifically documented that there's little to no support for the idea that those who watch horror movies or listen to metal are more likely to be aggressive. And increases in consumption of violent media is not correlated to increases in aggression. It's just an easy thing to blame instead of actually raising your kids with proper values. Draper and Adamczyk were already disturbed, and if they hadn't chosen to imitate Scream, they almost certainly would have chosen something else. And I think the same can be said about one of the most iconic faces to don the Ghostface mask, Stu Macher. He was clearly in it because of his psychotic tendencies and unresolved feelings about being dumped by Casey, and only used the movies as a framing for his crimes because he lives in a world where movies are the dominant form of culture. And I think the idea behind that kind of tracks with our world, where it seems like right now the most dominant forms of culture are politics and social media. And look what most real-world violence is centered around: politics and social media. Nearly 30 years later, Stu Macher remains one of the most memorable and beloved characters in the Scream franchise. Where Billy was controlled and calculated, Stu was theatrical, chaotic, and yet charismatic. It's no wonder his legacy has persisted beyond his natural lifespan. Even now, post-Scream 7, Matthew Lillard continues to campaign for Stu's return.
I think that they did a great job setting up that Stu is still alive. So I've already said, everyone's like, this is a good opportunity for Stu to come back. And I'm just gonna keep campaigning that Stu is still alive. I'm campaigning for it.
Hell yeah.
Campaigning for it. they did nothing but add to the legacy that Stu is still alive.
Like many things do in the Scream franchise, the intoxicating idea of Stu's survival has somehow permeated in our own world. And that aspect of actualization also applies to many other Scream characters. So make sure you click on that playlist on the left to learn the truth behind Cassie, Billy, Randy, and most importantly, the secrets of the Stab franchise itself. But first, let me peer pressure you into subscribing to CZsWorld for new horrors every week, ringing the death bell and making sure you select all notifications, and I will see you in the next one. Assuming we both survive. Boogat!